In a world where first impressions can make or break careers, where military precision demands perfection in every detail, one woman walked into the most exclusive briefing room in Washington, D.C., wearing what appeared to be a relic from a forgotten war. The jacket was worn, weathered, and completely out of place among the crisp uniforms and polished brass that filled the room. Captain Morrison's snicker echoed through the marble corridors as he whispered to his colleagues about the museum piece that had just walked past. Little did he know that the woman wearing that seemingly ancient jacket held clearance levels that exceeded his own, carried stories that would rewrite history books, and possessed knowledge of operations so classified that even their code names were buried in vaults 3 levels underground. What Captain Morrison was about to discover would shake his understanding of military hierarchy, challenge everything he thought he knew about elite forces, and reveal that sometimes the most powerful secrets are hidden in plain sight, worn proudly by those who have earned a right to carry them. The jacket wasn't just old, it was legendary. And the woman wearing it was about to prove that some uniforms are worth more than their appearance suggests. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's parking lot as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun pulled her sedan into a space reserved for senior officers. She sat for a moment in the driver's seat, her fingers absently tracing the worn fabric of the olive green jacket draped across the passenger seat. The jacket looked like it had been through several wars, its edges frayed, its color faded from countless washings, and its patches bearing symbols that most people wouldn't recognize. Sarah had been wearing this jacket for 15 years, through missions that officially never happened, through briefings that were erased from records before the ink was dry, and through moments that tested every fiber of her being. Today was different, though. Today, she was walking into the lion's den of traditional military bureaucracy, where appearance often mattered more than accomplishment. The Pentagon's corridors buzzed with the usual morning energy as Sarah made her way to Conference Room 2A, 924, a designation that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those with the right clearance. She passed groups of officers in pristine dress blues, their medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights, their shoes polished to mirror brightness. Several turned to look as she passed, their eyes immediately drawn to the jacket that seemed so out of place in this temple of military precision. Captain James Morrison was among those who noticed. A rising star in the intelligence division, Morrison prided himself on maintaining the highest standards of military bearing. His uniform was always perfect, his demeanor always sharp, and his opinions always vocal among his peer group. As Sarah passed his group near the coffee station, Morrison couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his observational skills to his colleagues. "Would you look at that?" Morrison said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure Sarah could hear him. "I thought this was a professional briefing, not a costume party. That jacket looks like it belongs in a military museum, not on the back of someone attending a classified intelligence meeting." His companions chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or remain silent. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wells, who had served long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, felt a knot form in her stomach. There was something about the woman in the worn jacket that commanded respect, something in her bearing that suggested depths Morrison couldn't fathom. Sarah heard every word, of course. She had developed exceptional hearing during her years in the field, where missing a whispered warning could mean the difference between life and death. But she had also learned patience, the kind that comes from facing down enemy forces in situations where diplomacy mattered more than firepower. She continued walking without turning around, her stride steady and purposeful. The briefing room was already half full when Sarah entered. She took a seat near the back, not out of humility, but out of habit. In her line of work, you always wanted to see who was coming and going, always wanted to position yourself where you could observe without being observed. The jacket drew more stares, more whispered comments, but Sarah remained focused on the agenda in front of her. The meeting was called to order by General Patricia Hayes, a woman whose reputation for no-nonsense leadership was legendary throughout the Pentagon. Hayes had called this particular gathering to discuss a series of security breaches that had been plaguing various intelligence agencies over the past 6 months. What made these breaches particularly troubling was their sophistication and the fact that they seemed to target very specific types of classified information. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hayes began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her position through merit rather than politics. We're here today to address a situation that threatens the very foundation of our national security infrastructure. Over the past 6 months, we've identified 17 separate incidents of unauthorized access to classified materials. These aren't random attacks or crimes of opportunity. Someone with intimate knowledge of our systems is feeding information to parties unknown. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the assembled officers. Security breaches were serious business, but 17 incidents suggested a level of coordination and inside knowledge that was truly alarming. General Hayes clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. The pattern suggests we're dealing with someone who has access to multiple agencies, someone whose clearance level allows them to move freely between departments that rarely share information. More troubling, the stolen information all relates to operations conducted between 1995 and 2010, suggesting our adversary has intimate knowledge of historical missions that were classified at the highest levels. Captain Morrison leaned forward in his seat, his mind already working through the implications. This was the kind of case that could make a career, the sort of investigation that would showcase his analytical abilities and attention to detail. He raised his hand to speak. General, has the investigation team considered the possibility that we're dealing with a former operative who has gone rogue? Someone who participated in these historical operations and is now selling information to hostile governments. General Hayes nodded approvingly. That's exactly the line of thinking that has led us to call this meeting, Captain. We need fresh eyes on this problem, people who can think outside the conventional boundaries of counterintelligence. Morrison preened slightly at the praise, shooting a quick glance around the room to ensure his colleagues had heard the general's approval. His eyes landed briefly on Sarah in her worn jacket, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of superiority. Here he was, being praised by a general for his analytical thinking, while someone who couldn't even dress properly for a Pentagon briefing sat silently in the back. However, General Hayes continued, we've also identified a more disturbing possibility. Our investigation has uncovered evidence that the breaches might be connected to a highly classified program that officially never existed. A program so sensitive that even discussing its existence requires special authorization from the highest levels of government. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. When military leaders talked about programs that officially never existed, they were entering territory that could end careers, programs that operated in the shadows where traditional rules didn't apply. These were the kinds of operations that historians would never write about, that journalists would never uncover, that existed in the gray areas between legal and necessary. Lieutenant Colonel Wells felt her palms begin to sweat. She had heard rumors over the years about such programs, whispered stories about operations that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even in the world of military intelligence. But she had always assumed they were just rumors, the kind of legends that grow around any large organization. General Hayes clicked the remote again, and a new slide appeared on the screen. This one showed a timeline, but most of the entries were blacked out with heavy redaction marks. Only dates and geographical locations remained visible. Somalia 1997, Bosnia 1999, Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003, and several others that were completely obscured. The program in question was designated Shadow Thread. General Hayes continued, her voice dropping to a tone that commanded absolute attention. It involved deep cover operations that required agents to assume false identities for extended periods, sometimes years at a time. These operatives worked without traditional military support, often without official acknowledgement of their existence. They were ghosts, moving through hostile territories and gathering intelligence that traditional methods couldn't obtain. The silence in the room was now complete. Even Morrison had stopped taking notes, his pen suspended over his pad as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. Shadow threat operatives would have access to information across multiple agencies because their work required them to move seamlessly between different branches of government. They would know about historical operations because they had participated in them. And they would be virtually impossible to track because their very existence was designed to be deniable. The problem, General Hayes said, advancing to the next slide, is that Shadow Thread was officially terminated in 2010. All operatives were supposedly debriefed and reassigned to conventional positions. But if our intelligence is correct, at least one Shadow Thread operative has gone dark, taking with them knowledge of operations that could compromise national security for decades to come. Sarah Chun sat perfectly still in her chair, her face showing no emotion as she listened to General Hayes describe the program that had defined her adult life. Shadow Thread hadn't just been her assignment. It had been her identity for 15 years. The missions described so clinically in the briefing had been her reality, lived one dangerous day at a time in places where discovery meant death and failure meant consequences that rippled through geopolitical relationships for years. The jacket she wore wasn't just old. It was an artifact of that life, a piece of equipment that had been with her through operations in 12 different countries. It had been modified over the years with hidden pockets for emergency equipment, reinforced with Kevlar panels that weren't visible from the outside, and equipped with communication devices that looked like ordinary buttons. To the officers sitting around her, it looked like a relic. To Sarah, it was a tool, carefully maintained and constantly updated to meet the demands of missions that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Morrison raised his hand again, his confidence growing with each contribution to the discussion. General, if I may ask, how many Shadow Thread operatives were active during the program's operational period? Surely we have a complete list of personnel who would have access to this type of information. General Hayes paused, and for the first time during the briefing, Sarah saw something that might have been amusement cross the general's face. That's where things become complicated, Captain. Shadow Thread operatives didn't exist in traditional personnel systems. Their identities were compartmentalized to such a degree that even their handlers often didn't know their real names. We have estimates rather than exact numbers. How many? Morrison pressed, sensing that he was on to something important. Our best estimates suggest that Shadow Thread employed between 12 and 18 operatives over its 15-year operational period. Some served for only specific missions. Others were embedded for years at a time. The nature of their work meant that traditional record-keeping was impossible. Morrison's mind raced with the implications. Somewhere among the hundreds of intelligence personnel who had served during that period, a maximum of 18 individuals had the knowledge necessary to commit the breaches they were investigating. It was still a large number for a manhunt, but it was manageable. More importantly, it was the kind of analytical breakthrough that could establish his reputation as a serious investigator. General, he said, his voice filled with the confidence of someone who believed he was solving a puzzle. If we cross-reference personnel records from the affected agencies with deployment records from the Shadow Thread operational period, we should be able to develop a short list of suspects. Someone with the access level needed to commit these breaches would have left a paper trail, even if their Shadow Thread activities were classified. General Hayes nodded slowly, and Sarah noticed that several other officers in the room were taking notes now, following Morrison's line of reasoning with obvious interest. The captain was demonstrating exactly the kind of systematic thinking that traditional intelligence analysis required, the methodical approach that had served the military well for decades. You're absolutely right, Captain, General Hayes said. In fact, we've already begun that process. Which brings us to the reason for today's meeting. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced moments before major operations began. She had learned to trust that feeling over the years. It usually meant that careful preparation was about to meet unexpected reality. General Hayes clicked the remote one final time, and a new slide appeared on the screen. This one was different from the others. Instead of redacted documents or analytical charts, it showed a simple organizational chart with a single name at the top, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, followed by a series of dates and locations that matched perfectly with the Shadow Thread operational timeline. The room erupted in whispers and rustling papers as officers turned to look toward the back of the room where Sarah sat. Morrison's confident expression faltered as he realized that the worn jacket suddenly made perfect sense, that the woman he had mocked was sitting directly behind him, and that his careful analysis had just led him to identify someone who was already in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes said, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade, "I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, the sole remaining Shadow Thread operative whose whereabouts we could definitively account for. She's here today not as a suspect in our investigation, but as our best hope of solving it." The silence that followed General Hayes's introduction stretched for what felt like an eternity. Captain Morrison felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the magnitude of his error. The woman he had publicly ridiculed, whose appearance he had mocked in front of his peers, was not just another officer attending a briefing. She was the embodiment of a program so classified that its very existence had been a matter of national security debate at the highest levels of government. Sarah Chun rose from her seat with fluid grace, her movements betraying none of the tension that filled the room. As she walked toward the front, every eye followed her, and officers who had dismissed her appearance minutes earlier now found themselves reassessing everything they thought they knew about military bearing and professional presence. "Thank you, General Hayes," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to transform the very atmosphere of the room. "Before we proceed, I think it's important for everyone here to understand exactly what Shadow Thread was and why the security breaches we're investigating represent a threat unlike anything our intelligence community has faced before." She moved to stand beside the projection screen, and as she did, Sarah reached into one of the hidden pockets of her jacket. Morrison watched in fascination as she withdrew what appeared to be an ordinary pen, but with a quick twist of her wrist, it transformed into a presentation remote. The seemingly worn jacket, he realized, was anything but ordinary. Shadow Thread wasn't just another intelligence program, Sarah continued, advancing to a slide that showed a world map dotted with red markers. It was an acknowledgement that the post-Cold War world required a fundamentally different approach to gathering human intelligence. Traditional methods, embassy attaches, official military advisors, diplomatic channels, were becoming increasingly ineffective against non-state actors and asymmetric threats. Lieutenant Colonel Wells leaned forward, her earlier discomfort now replaced by genuine curiosity. She had spent her career analyzing intelligence from traditional sources, but the woman standing before them was describing a world she had only read about in heavily redacted reports. "The red markers you see represent locations where Shadow Thread operatives conducted extended missions," Sarah said, using a laser pointer that had appeared from another hidden pocket. "These weren't quick in-and-out operations. Some assignments lasted for years, requiring operatives to build genuine lives in hostile territories, to develop real relationships with people they might eventually have to betray, and to maintain cover identities that were tested daily by people whose survival depended on detecting deception." Morrison found himself taking notes again, but now his writing was driven by fascination rather than ambition. The analytical part of his mind was working to process the implications of what Sarah was describing. Traditional intelligence operatives worked with the backing of their home governments, with extraction plans and communication protocols that provided at least some measure of safety. Shadow Thread operatives had operated without those safeguards, relying entirely on their training and instincts. "The jacket," Sarah said, pausing to touch the worn fabric with something that might have been affection, "is standard issue for Shadow Thread operatives, though most people wouldn't recognize it as military equipment. It's been through 13 countries with me, modified and updated as technology advanced, but always maintaining the appearance of something ordinary, something that wouldn't draw attention." She turned to face Morrison directly, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force. Captain Morrison's earlier comment about museum pieces isn't entirely wrong. This jacket is a piece of history, but it's living history, still functional, still serving its purpose, just like the people who wore them. Morrison felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Sarah's tone held no malice. She was simply stating facts, treating his error as a teaching moment rather than a personal attack. Somehow, that made him feel even worse about his earlier behavior. The reason this jacket matters to our current investigation, Sarah continued, returning her attention to the larger group, is that it represents a level of operational security that made Shadow Thread both incredibly effective and nearly impossible to supervise through traditional means. We operated in a world where a single mistake could compromise not just our mission, but the lives of everyone we had worked with over months or years. General Hayes stepped forward, resuming control of the briefing. Lieutenant Colonel Chun has agreed to share details about Shadow Threat operations that have never been disclosed outside the highest levels of government. Her cooperation is voluntary and represents a significant personal risk, as much of what she's about to tell you could be considered evidence of activities that operated in legal gray areas. Sarah nodded, her expression growing more serious. The first thing you need to understand about the security breaches we're investigating is that they're not random. Whoever is responsible has intimate knowledge not just of what information exists, but where it's stored, how it's classified, and, most importantly, which pieces of information are connected to other pieces in ways that aren't obvious from the documents themselves. She clicked to a new slide that showed a complex diagram of interconnected nodes, like a spider web of relationships between different pieces of intelligence. Shadow Threat operations were designed to be compartmentalized, but they were also designed to be connected. Information gathered in Somalia in 1997 might not make sense until it was combined with intelligence from Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. Our adversary understands these connections. Lieutenant Colonel Wells raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, are you suggesting that whoever is responsible for the breaches is someone who participated in multiple Shadow Threat operations across different theaters? Sarah's smile was grim. I'm suggesting that whoever is responsible has access to the master database that connected all Shadow Threat operations, a system so classified that it existed on isolated servers in a facility that officially doesn't exist. The room erupted in quiet conversations as the implications sank in. Morrison felt like he was drinking from a fire hose, trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about how intelligence operations were conducted. The existence of a master database suggested a level of centralized control that seemed to contradict Sarah's earlier description of compartmentalized operations. The database was called Threadbare, Sarah continued, overriding the conversations with the authority in her voice. It contained not just operational reports, but predictive analyses, psychological profiles of targets, and, most dangerously, detailed information about the cover identities and personal histories that Shadow Threat operatives had constructed over years of work. General Hayes stepped forward again. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, can you explain to the group why the Threadbare database represents such a significant security threat? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Morrison could see her weighing how much detail to provide. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was sharing information that came at great personal cost. When Shadow Thread was terminated in 2010, most operatives transitioned to conventional assignments, but our cover identities weren't dismantled. They were maintained as intelligence assets, ready to be reactivated if needed. The Threadbare database contains the keys to identities that are still active, still functional, still trusted by people in sensitive positions around the world. The room was completely silent now. Even General Hayes seemed to be holding her breath as the full scope of the security threat became clear. If someone has access to Threadbare, Sarah said, they don't just have historical intelligence. They have the ability to assume identities that have been carefully cultivated over decades, identities that come with established relationships, financial accounts, and, most importantly, trust relationships with people who hold sensitive positions in foreign governments and terrorist organizations. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He had been thinking about the investigation in terms of stolen documents and compromised information, but Sarah was describing something far more dangerous. Someone with access to the Shadow Thread database could potentially become any of the operatives who had worked for the program, inheriting years of relationship building and trust establishment with a simple change of documents. "How many cover identities are we talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him directly again, and this time he saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Each Shadow Thread operative maintained an average of 3 to 5 deep cover identities over the course of their career. Some were developed for single missions and then discarded, but others were maintained for years as ongoing intelligence assets. She paused, and Morrison realized she was doing mental calculations. Across the entire program, we estimate that there are approximately 73 fully functional cover identities that remain active and trusted by their respective communities. Lieutenant Colonel Wells spoke up, her voice strained. "Lieutenant Colonel, what kind of communities are we talking about? Who trusts these identities?" Sarah's response was measured and deliberate. "Arms dealers in Eastern Europe who believe they're selling to established customers. Financial networks in the Middle East that have processed millions of dollars in transactions from accounts controlled by these identities. Technology companies in Asia that have provided equipment based on relationships built over years of careful cultivation." The weight of what she was describing settled over the room like a blanket. Morrison realized that they weren't just investigating a security breach. They were potentially facing the compromise of an entire intelligence infrastructure that had taken decades to build. "But there's something else," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was about to share the most troubling information yet. "The pattern of the security breaches suggests that whoever has access to Threadbare isn't just stealing information randomly. They're systematically extracting intelligence that would allow them to identify and compromise Shadow Thread operatives who are still active." General Hayes stepped forward, her face pale. "Are you saying that someone is hunting Shadow Thread operatives?" Sarah nodded grimly. "I'm saying that someone with access to the most sensitive intelligence database in American history is using that access to systematically dismantle a program that was supposed to be our insurance policy against asymmetric threats. And they're doing it from the inside." Morrison felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. What had started as an investigation into document theft had evolved into something that threatened the very foundations of American intelligence gathering. Someone wasn't just stealing secrets. They were using those secrets to hunt down the people who had risked everything to gather them in the first place. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun," he said, surprising himself with his boldness, "if someone is hunting Shadow Thread operatives, why are you here? Why are you revealing yourself instead of staying hidden?" Sarah turned to face him fully, and for the first time since the briefing began, Morrison saw something that might have been approval in her expression. "Because, Captain Morrison," she said, "the best way to catch a hunter is to make yourself the most attractive target." The revelation that Sarah Chan intended to use herself as bait sent shockwaves through the briefing room that were almost physical in their intensity. Morrison found himself gripping his pen so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, while Lieutenant Colonel Wells had unconsciously pushed her chair back from the table as if distance could somehow protect her from the implications of what she was hearing. General Hayes maintained her composure, but those who knew her well could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I need you to explain exactly what you're proposing. The Pentagon doesn't typically approve operations that deliberately endanger our most valuable intelligence assets." Sarah moved away from the projection screen and began pacing slowly in front of the assembled officers, her movements precise and controlled. Morrison noticed that even her casual pacing seemed tactical, positioning her where she could observe everyone in the room while maintaining clear sight lines to both entrances. "General, with respect, I'm not proposing anything that isn't already happening," Sarah said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions in hostile territory. "The hunter already knows I exist. My presence here today, my participation in this briefing, my willingness to discuss shadow threat operations. All of this will be reported back to whoever is orchestrating these security breaches within hours of our meeting's conclusion. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the officers present realized they were sitting in what might be an active battlefield. Morrison's eyes darted around the room, studying his colleagues with new suspicion. If Sarah was right, someone in this room was feeding information to an enemy who was systematically destroying one of America's most sensitive intelligence programs. Lieutenant Colonel Wells raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, are you saying you believe the person responsible for the breaches is someone with access to this briefing?" Sarah stopped pacing and fixed Wells with a steady gaze. "I'm saying that the pattern of security breaches demonstrates intimate knowledge, not just of historical operations, but of current intelligence community activities. Whoever is responsible knows about ongoing investigations, current personnel assignments, and real-time operational decisions. That level of access requires someone who is embedded deep within the intelligence community's current structure." Morrison felt his analytical mind engaging despite the personal stakes involved. "Lieutenant Colonel, if you're correct about the timing of information being passed along, wouldn't that give us an opportunity to identify the source? We could track who had access to today's briefing and monitor their communications over the next few hours." Sarah's expression suggested she was impressed with Morrison's reasoning, which somehow made him feel worse about his earlier behavior rather than better. Captain Morrison raises an excellent point, but it assumes that our adversary is careless enough to use traceable communication methods. Unfortunately, someone with access to shadow thread operational techniques would understand how to communicate without leaving digital fingerprints. General Hayes stepped forward again, her role as meeting facilitator requiring her to maintain some semblance of control over a discussion that was rapidly spiraling into territory none of them had anticipated. "Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I need you to walk us through your operational plan. If you're proposing to use yourself as bait, I need to understand how you intend to control the situation and what kind of support you'll require." Sarah returned to the projection screen and advanced to a new slide that showed a detailed timeline spanning the next 2 weeks. Morrison was surprised to see that she had clearly been planning this operation for some time, probably since before today's briefing had even been scheduled. "The plan is elegantly simple," Sarah began, using her laser pointer to highlight specific dates on the timeline. "Over the next 2 weeks, I will gradually reveal information about my current activities and location through channels that our adversary is known to monitor. I'll make myself appear vulnerable, isolated, and, most importantly, in possession of information that could compromise other shadow threat operatives who are still active." Lieutenant Colonel Wells leaned forward, her expression troubled. "Ma'am, what you're describing sounds like an assassination invitation. If someone is actively hunting shadow threat operatives, why would you make yourself an easier target?" Sarah's smile was grim but determined. "Because the alternative is allowing our adversary to continue picking off operatives one by one, using information from the Threadbare database to identify and eliminate people who have spent decades building intelligence assets that can't be replaced. At least this way, we can choose the time and place of the confrontation." Morrison found himself studying the timeline more carefully, his analytical training helping him identify potential weaknesses in Sarah's plan. "Lieutenant Colonel, this timeline assumes that whoever is hunting shadow threat operatives will take the bait within 2 weeks. What if they're more patient than that? What if they're willing to wait months or even years to strike when you're more vulnerable?" Sarah nodded approvingly at his question. Captain Morrison continues to demonstrate excellent analytical thinking. "You're absolutely right that patience would be the smart play for our adversary, which is why the information I'll be revealing will include time-sensitive intelligence that will force them to act quickly if they want to prevent other shadow threat operatives from disappearing into deep cover." General Hayes stepped closer to the projection screen, studying the timeline with the intensity of someone whose career had been built on evaluating operational risks. "Lieutenant Colonel, what kind of time-sensitive intelligence are we talking about?" I hope you're not planning to compromise active operations just to draw out whoever is responsible for these security breaches. Sarah's pause was so brief that Morrison almost missed it, but he caught the slight hesitation that suggested General Hayes had touched on something significant. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a weight that indicated she was about to share information that came at considerable personal cost. General, there's something about the Shadow thread termination in 2010 that wasn't included in the official records. While the program was officially disbanded, 3 operatives were never successfully extracted from their deep cover assignments. They remain active, maintaining their cover identities and continuing to gather intelligence in situations too dangerous for traditional extraction. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that Morrison could hear his own heartbeat. 3 Shadow thread operatives, still active after the program's official termination, represented intelligence assets of incalculable value. They also represented human beings whose lives were at constant risk, whose very existence was known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Lieutenant Colonel Wells was the first to break the silence. Ma'am, if these 3 operatives are still active, revealing their existence as part of a trap operation would essentially be signing their death warrants. How can you justify that risk? Sarah's expression hardened, and Morrison saw something in her eyes that reminded him that this woman had spent 15 years making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Wells, I can justify that risk because if we don't catch whoever is hunting Shadow threat operatives, those 3 people are going to die anyway. At least this way, their sacrifice might save others. General Hayes moved away from the projection screen, her face showing the strain of someone who was being forced to evaluate options that had no good outcomes. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I need you to explain exactly how you plan to use information about these active operatives without actually compromising their positions. What you're describing sounds like an operational impossibility. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed a complex diagram of information flow between different intelligence databases. The key is understanding how our adversary is accessing the Threadbare database. They're not just randomly stealing information. They're following specific data trails that lead from historical operations to current intelligence assets. By revealing carefully selected pieces of information about the 3 active operatives, I can create a data trail that appears to lead to their locations, but actually leads to a trap. Morrison studied the diagram, his mind working to understand the connection Sarah was describing. You're talking about creating false data trails that look real enough to fool someone with access to the Threadbare database. But wouldn't that require you to have administrative access to the very system that's been compromised? Sarah's smile was the first genuine expression of pleasure Morrison had seen from her. Captain Morrison, you continue to impress me with your analytical abilities. You're absolutely correct that this plan requires administrative access to Threadbare. Which brings us to something else that wasn't included in the official Shadow thread termination records. General Hayes froze, her expression showing that she was beginning to understand implications that she didn't like. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, please tell me you're not about to reveal that you maintained unauthorized access to a classified database after your official reassignment. Sarah's response was careful and precise. General, I'm about to reveal that certain Shadow threat operatives were specifically tasked with maintaining access to the Threadbare database in case of exactly this type of security crisis. The access wasn't unauthorized. It was compartmentalized to such a degree that even you weren't briefed on its existence. The room erupted in quiet chaos as officers struggled to process what they were hearing. Morrison felt like he was watching a magic trick being performed in reverse, with each revelation making the impossible seem more real rather than less. A program that was supposedly terminated had active operatives still in the field. A database that was supposedly secure was being accessed by someone who was hunting American intelligence agents. And the woman sitting in front of them, wearing a jacket that looked like military surplus, apparently had access to information systems that officially didn't exist. Lieutenant Colonel Wells raised her hand, her voice carrying a note of desperation. Ma'am, If you have administrative access to the threadbare database, couldn't you simply identify who else has been accessing it? Wouldn't that immediately reveal the identity of whoever is responsible for the security breaches? Sarah's expression grew sad, and Morrison realized that they had just asked a question that she had been hoping to avoid. Lieutenant Colonel Wells, that would be the logical approach if we were dealing with unauthorized external access. But the access logs show that all recent queries have been made using legitimate credentials belonging to people who have official authorization to access the system. General Hayes sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the implications of Sarah's statement hitting her like a physical blow. You're telling me that whoever is hunting shadow threat operatives is someone who has legitimate access to the most classified intelligence database in American history? Sarah nodded grimly. I'm telling you that we're dealing with a traitor at the highest levels of the intelligence community, someone whose clearance level and access permissions are so extensive that they can move through our most sensitive systems without raising any automated security flags. Morrison felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They weren't just investigating security breaches. They were attempting to identify and stop someone who had spent years, possibly decades, building the trust and access necessary to systematically destroy one of America's most effective intelligence programs. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, he said, his voice carrying a new level of respect and understanding. When you say you're planning to use yourself as bait, you're not just talking about risking your life. You're talking about engaging in direct confrontation with someone who has access to resources that most of us can't even imagine. Sarah stood up, her movements conveying the same quiet confidence that had characterized her throughout the briefing. Captain Morrison, you're absolutely right about the resources our adversary has access to. But there's something they don't have that I do. She touched the worn fabric of her jacket again, and Morrison finally understood that the gesture wasn't sentimental. It was tactical. They have access to databases and electronic intelligence, but I have 15 years of experience staying alive in situations where every advantage was held by the enemy. Sometimes, the most sophisticated technology in the world can't compete with human instinct and hard-earned experience. General Hayes stood up as well, her expression showing that she was preparing to make a decision that would affect far more than just the people in the room. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I'm going to ask you one final question, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. Do you believe this plan has a reasonable chance of success, or are you simply choosing to die on your own terms rather than waiting to be hunted down? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see her weighing not just her response, but the very foundations of the decision she was asking them to support. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone who had stared death in the face so many times that it no longer held any surprises. General Hayes, I believe this plan gives us the best chance of stopping a threat that could compromise American intelligence operations for decades to come. But you're also right that I'm choosing to control the circumstances of my own risk rather than allowing someone else to dictate when and how that risk manifests. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of officers who had entered the briefing expecting a routine security discussion, and instead found themselves participants in an operation that would determine the fate of one of America's most secret programs. What I can promise you is this: whether this plan succeeds or fails, we will learn the identity of whoever is hunting shadow threat operatives. And that information will be enough to protect the people who are still out there, still risking their lives for intelligence that keeps this country safe. The decision to authorize Sarah Chin's operation was made in a secure conference room 3 floors below the Pentagon's main level, in a space that existed on no public building plans and required clearances that most military personnel would never possess. General Hayes had dismissed the original briefing participants with instructions that were both clear and ominous. Everything they had heard was classified beyond their current access levels, and any discussion of the meeting's contents outside officially authorized channels would be considered an act of treason. Captain Morrison found himself walking through the Pentagon's corridors in a daze, his worldview fundamentally altered by 3 hours of revelations that had challenged everything he thought he knew about military intelligence. The woman he had ridiculed for her appearance had turned out to be a living legend, someone whose experiences read like fiction, but whose credentials were unquestionably real. More troubling, he had come to understand that his analytical skills, while impressive in academic settings, were woefully inadequate for the world Sarah Chun inhabited. Lieutenant Colonel Wells had left the building immediately after the briefing, but not before seeking out Morrison to deliver a piece of advice that would haunt his thoughts for weeks to come. "Captain," she had said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had served long enough to recognize defining moments. "What we witnessed today wasn't just a briefing about security breaches. It was a masterclass in humility. I suggest you remember that feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance." Morrison had nodded, unable to find words adequate to express his shame and newfound respect. The woman in the worn jacket had demonstrated more grace under pressure, more strategic thinking, and more courage than he had ever witnessed in his military career. Her willingness to use herself as bait wasn't bravado. It was the calculated decision of someone who understood that some threats required personal sacrifice to neutralize. But Morrison's personal growth was secondary to the larger drama unfolding within the intelligence community. Over the following week, Sarah Chun began implementing her plan with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of deception. Her movements through the Pentagon became more frequent and more visible. Her attendance at meetings that would normally be beneath her notice increased dramatically, and, most importantly, her electronic communications began carrying subtle hints about intelligence assets that only someone with access to the threadbare database would understand. The transformation was remarkable to those who knew to look for it. Sarah's worn jacket remained a constant, but her behavior shifted in ways that made her appear increasingly vulnerable and isolated. She began eating lunch alone in public areas, checking her phone with obvious anxiety, and making trips to the Pentagon's parking garage that seemed to serve no official purpose. To casual observers, she appeared to be someone struggling with stress and possibly making poor security decisions. But to someone hunting shadow threat operatives, her behavior would read as something entirely different. The lunch meetings that seemed random were actually carefully orchestrated encounters with intelligence personnel who had access to information about the 3 active operatives still in the field. The anxious phone checking was part of a communication pattern designed to suggest she was receiving updates from assets in hostile territories. The trips to the parking garage were meant to appear like dead drops or surveillance detection routes that had become sloppy due to operational stress. General Hayes monitored the operation from a command center that had been established in one of the Pentagon's most secure facilities. Banks of monitors showed Sarah's movements in real time, tracked through a combination of official security cameras and surveillance equipment that had been temporarily installed for the operation. Communications specialists monitored electronic traffic for any indication that Sarah's bait was attracting attention from whoever had been accessing the threadbare database. The first indication that the plan was working came on day 6 of the operation. Sarah had spent the afternoon in a series of meetings with personnel from different intelligence agencies, discussions that appeared routine, but had been carefully designed to create electronic signatures suggesting coordination between multiple shadow, thread-related activities. At 1800 hours, surveillance detected the first sign that her activities were being monitored. A sedan with government plates had been parked across from the Pentagon's main entrance for 47 minutes, positioned where its occupants could observe personnel leaving the building. The vehicle's license plate traced back to a motor pool used by multiple intelligence agencies, making identification of its specific occupant impossible through normal channels. But its presence suggested that someone was taking a personal interest in Sarah's activities rather than relying solely on electronic surveillance. General Hayes felt her pulse quicken as she watched the surveillance feed. The presence of physical surveillance meant they were dealing with someone who had the resources and authorization to requisition government vehicles for personal use. More importantly, It suggested someone who understood that certain types of intelligence gathering required human observation rather than electronic monitoring. "General," came a voice from one of the communication stations. "We're detecting unusual query patterns in the threadbare access logs. Someone has been running searches on Lieutenant Colonel Chen's historical assignments and cross-referencing them with current personnel databases." Hayes moved to the communication station, studying the data streams that showed patterns of database access in real time. The queries were sophisticated, demonstrating intimate knowledge of how shadow thread operational records were structured and where related information might be stored in other systems. More troubling, the access was happening during off-duty hours, suggesting someone who was going to considerable effort to avoid detection. "Can we trace the queries to specific terminals or user accounts?" Hayes asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Negative, General. The access is being routed through multiple proxy servers and appears to be using rotating credentials from several different authorized users. Whoever is doing this has either compromised multiple accounts or has administrative access that allows them to assume other identities within the system." Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. Administrative access to the Threadbare database was limited to fewer than 12 people in the entire intelligence community, individuals whose backgrounds have been investigated more thoroughly than Supreme Court justices. If one of those 12 people was hunting shadow thread operatives, the implications extended far beyond a single rogue operation. Meanwhile, Sarah Chan was conducting her own form of surveillance from her apartment in a secure complex reserved for intelligence personnel. The building's security was excellent, but Sarah had spent years developing skills that made traditional security measures largely irrelevant. Through a combination of mirror placement, window positioning, and casual observation techniques, she had identified 3 different vehicles that had maintained surveillance on her building over the past week. The most interesting was a van that appeared to belong to a telecommunications maintenance company, complete with official markings and equipment that would fool casual inspection. But Sarah had noticed that the van's positioning allowed its occupants to monitor both the building's entrances and its parking garage, while the equipment visible through its windows hadn't moved in 6 days of supposed maintenance work. She had also identified 2 patterns of foot surveillance that were too professional to be coincidental. Joggers who appeared in her neighborhood at times that coincided with her departures from the building, dog walkers whose routes seemed designed to provide observation of her vehicle, and delivery personnel who spent too much time studying the building's layout while supposedly making routine deliveries. The level of surveillance confirmed that her plan was working, but it also indicated that whoever was hunting her had resources that extended well beyond simple database access. The coordination between electronic monitoring and physical surveillance suggested either a large organization or an individual with access to significant operational support. On day 8 of the operation, Sarah decided to escalate the situation by introducing what appeared to be a critical vulnerability in her security procedures. She began making evening visits to a coffee shop located in a commercial district 3 miles from her apartment, always arriving at approximately 1930 hours and always carrying a briefcase that suggested she was conducting unofficial business. The coffee shop visits were carefully choreographed to create multiple opportunities for approach or attack, while maintaining enough security to give Sarah a reasonable chance of survival if the encounter went badly. The location was public enough to discourage obvious violence, but isolated enough that a professional could create circumstances for a private conversation. Most importantly, the timing put her in a predictable location during hours when official support would be limited. General Hayes watched the coffee shop visits through live surveillance feeds with growing anxiety. Each evening, Sarah would enter the establishment, order the same drink, and sit at a table positioned where she could observe both entrances while appearing to read intelligence reports that were actually carefully prepared documents designed to suggest she was coordinating with the 3 active shadow threat operatives. The breakthrough came on day 10. At 1943 hours, surveillance detected a figure entering the coffee shop who matched none of the established patterns of legitimate customers. The individual was approximately 6 feet tall, moved with the controlled precision of someone with extensive military training, and, most significantly, seemed to know exactly where Sarah would be sitting despite having no apparent way to have observed her earlier visits. General Hayes leaned forward, studying the surveillance feed with intense concentration. The figure approaching Sarah's table was wearing civilian clothes that were too well fitted and too expensive for someone without significant resources. More telling, their movement patterns showed the hyper-awareness of surroundings that characterized intelligence professionals rather than ordinary citizens. Sarah looked up from her documents as the figure approached, her expression showing no surprise despite the fact that she had no way of knowing who was about to join her. The conversation that followed was too quiet for the surveillance equipment to capture audio, but Sarah's body language suggested she was dealing with someone she either knew or had been expecting. After 17 minutes of conversation, the figure stood and walked toward the coffee shop's rear exit, a route that would take them away from the primary surveillance positions. Sarah remained seated for another 12 minutes before gathering her documents and departing through the main entrance, her movements showing none of the tension that Hayes expected from someone who had just been confronted by a potential adversary. The surveillance teams attempted to follow the figure who had met with Sarah, but their target demonstrated evasion skills that suggested extensive training in counter-surveillance techniques. Within 4 blocks of the coffee shop, the pursuit teams lost track of their target despite having multiple assets in the area and aerial support from an unmarked helicopter. General Hayes felt a mixture of frustration and admiration as she watched the surveillance team struggle to maintain contact with someone who moved through urban terrain like a ghost. Whoever had approached Sarah possessed skills that rivaled those of the most elite military units, abilities that suggested years of training and operational experience. But the failed surveillance attempt also provided crucial intelligence. The evasion techniques used by Sarah's contact were consistent with shadow, thread, training protocols, movement patterns that had been developed specifically for operations in hostile urban environments. The implications were troubling. Either they were dealing with a current or former shadow threat operative, or someone who had access to training materials that were supposed to be classified beyond any unauthorized access. Sarah returned to her apartment that evening with the knowledge that the most dangerous phase of her operation was about to begin. The conversation in the coffee shop had confirmed her suspicions about the identity of the person hunting shadow threat operatives, but it had also revealed that the situation was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The person she had met wasn't just a traitor selling information for money or ideology. They were someone who believed they were protecting national security by eliminating shadow threat operatives who they viewed as uncontrolled assets representing an unacceptable risk to American intelligence operations. The hunter wasn't motivated by greed or foreign allegiance. They were motivated by a fundamentally different philosophy about how intelligence operations should be conducted in the modern world. As Sarah prepared for what she knew would be the final phase of her operation, she reflected on the conversation that had changed everything she thought she understood about the threat they were facing. The worn jacket hanging in her closet had been through 13 countries and countless dangerous situations, but it had never protected her from an enemy who genuinely believed they were serving their country by destroying everything she had spent her career building. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to continue with her plan to draw out the shadow threat hunter, knowing now that success might require her to kill someone whose motivations were disturbingly similar to her own. The final confrontation came not in a dramatic nighttime encounter or a carefully orchestrated trap, but in the most unlikely of places, the Pentagon's own executive parking garage at 0630 hours on a Tuesday morning. Sarah Chun had arrived early for what was supposed to be a routine debriefing with General Hayes, but as she walked toward the elevator bank, she noticed that the overhead lighting in Section C had been modified in a way that created strategic blind spots for the building's surveillance cameras. The modification was subtle, visible only to someone trained to recognize such things, and it told Sarah that her hunter had decided to end their cat and mouse game a location where they felt confident they could control the outcome. More troubling, the ability to modify Pentagon security systems suggested access levels that extended far beyond simple database queries or borrowed vehicles. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had carried her through 15 years of dangerous operations settle over her mind as she recognized that the next few minutes would determine not just her own survival, but the fate of 3 Shadow Thread operatives still active in hostile territories around the world. The worn jacket that had protected her through operations on 4 continents felt lighter somehow, as if it understood that this might be its final mission. Lieutenant-Colonel Shen. The voice came from the shadows between 2 vehicles, spoken by someone who knew her name, but whose own identity remained carefully concealed. I believe it's time we had a more comprehensive conversation than our coffee shop meeting allowed. Sarah turned toward the voice, her movements casual but her mind already calculating distances, cover positions, and potential escape routes. The person emerging from the shadows was someone she recognized, though the recognition brought no comfort. Deputy Director Marcus Holloway had been responsible for Shadow Threat oversight during the program's final 3 years, and his access to classified databases was exceeded by only a handful of people in the entire intelligence community. "Director Holloway," Sarah said, her voice carrying none of the surprise she felt. "I was wondering when you would decide to approach me directly rather than relying on electronic surveillance and borrowed vehicles." Holloway smiled, but the expression held no warmth. He was a man in his late 50s whose appearance suggested the soft lifestyle of a career bureaucrat, but Sarah's training allowed her to see the controlled tension in his posture that indicated someone prepared for violence. More concerning, his positioning suggested he was not working alone. "Lieutenant Colonel, I want you to understand that nothing personal motivates what has to happen here today. You've conducted yourself with admirable professionalism throughout this entire operation, and I respect both your skills and your dedication to what you believe is your duty." Sarah nodded, recognizing the tone of someone who was preparing to justify actions they knew were morally questionable. "Director, I'm curious about something. When you decided that Shadow Thread operatives represented an unacceptable security risk, did you consider that eliminating us might compromise intelligence operations that have taken decades to develop?" Holloway's expression hardened. "Lieutenant Colonel, the intelligence operations you're referring to are exactly the problem. Shadow Thread created assets that operate outside normal oversight, relationships that can't be audited or controlled, and, worst of all, operatives whose psychological profiles suggest they've been fundamentally changed by years of deep cover work." He began moving slowly to his right, and Sarah recognized the movement as part of a containment strategy designed to limit her options for escape or counterattack. The presence of additional personnel became clear as she noticed subtle shifts in the shadows around the parking garage that indicated at least 2 other people were positioned to intercept her if she attempted to flee. "You're concerned about psychological stability?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Holloway's reasoning. "Director, the psychological evaluations conducted during Shadow Threat operations were more comprehensive than anything required for traditional intelligence assignments. Every operative underwent monthly assessments by specialists who understood the unique stresses of deep cover work." Holloway's laugh was bitter. "Lieutenant Colonel, I've read those psychological evaluations. Do you know what they show? They show that prolonged exposure to deep cover operations fundamentally alters personality structure in ways that make traditional loyalty assessments meaningless. Shadow Thread operatives don't just pretend to be other people. They become other people, often to the extent that their original identities are subsumed by their cover personas." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Holloway's assessment wasn't entirely wrong, and his access to psychological evaluations meant he understood aspects of Shadow Threat operations that had been classified beyond the reach of most oversight personnel. "Director, are you saying that you've been eliminating Shadow Threat operatives because you believe we're no longer capable of serving American interests?" "I'm saying that Shadow Threat operatives represent sleeper agents whose ultimate loyalties are unknowable and whose capabilities exceed those of most foreign intelligence services. The program created a category of American intelligence personnel who are essentially stateless actors with the skills and access necessary to compromise national security from within. Holloway paused his movement, positioning himself approximately 15 feet from Sarah's position. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, your own case is illustrative. According to your psychological evaluations, you've spent so many years living under false identities that you demonstrate measurable difficulty distinguishing between operational personas and your original personality. How can we trust someone whose sense of self has been fundamentally compromised by their training? Sarah considered Holloway's words with the analytical detachment that had served her through countless dangerous situations. His assessment contained enough truth to be troubling, but his conclusion represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how identity worked in the context of deep cover operations. Director, you're correct that deep cover work changes people in ways that aren't fully understood by traditional psychology. But you're wrong about the implications of those changes. Shadow threat operatives don't lose their original identities. They develop additional identities that can be activated when circumstances require them. It's not personality dissolution, it's personality multiplication. She began moving as well, her path designed to maintain conversational distance while improving her position relative to the additional personnel she knew were present. The question isn't whether we can be trusted despite these psychological changes. The question is whether the intelligence community can afford to lose assets who have capabilities that took decades to develop. Holloway's expression showed that he had expected this line of argument. Lieutenant Colonel, that's exactly the thinking that led to Shadow Thread becoming an uncontrolled program in the first place. The assumption that exceptional capabilities justify exceptional risks, that national security benefits outweigh the dangers of creating operatives who exist outside normal oversight structures. The conversation was interrupted by a subtle electronic beeping that Sarah recognized as the sound of her jacket's communication system receiving an encrypted message. The sound was too quiet for Holloway to hear, but Sarah's training allowed her to interpret the pattern of beeps without conscious attention. General Hayes was attempting to contact her, which suggested that surveillance teams had identified the confrontation in progress. Director Holloway, Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of finality, I need to ask you directly, how many Shadow Threat operatives have you eliminated, and what do you plan to do about the 3 who are still active in the field? Holloway's pause was so brief that most people would have missed it, but Sarah caught the slight hesitation that suggested she had touched on something significant. Lieutenant Colonel, I want you to understand that every action I've taken has been carefully considered and approved through appropriate channels. The elimination of compromised Shadow Threat operatives has been conducted according to protocols that exist specifically for situations where traditional oversight has failed. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she realized what Holloway was telling her. You're saying that killing American intelligence operatives has been officially approved? That there are protocols for eliminating our own people? I'm saying that Shadow Thread was terminated for reasons that went far beyond budgetary concerns or strategic reorganization. The program created assets that represented fundamental threats to intelligence community security, and those threats required permanent solutions. The sound of footsteps on concrete indicated that the additional personnel Holloway had positioned were beginning to close their perimeter. Sarah's options for escape were diminishing rapidly, but her operational experience suggested that escape might not be the appropriate tactical choice. Sometimes the best way to win a confrontation was to change the nature of the confrontation itself. Director, Sarah said, reaching slowly into one of the hidden pockets of her jacket, before this conversation concludes, I think you should know that everything we've discussed has been recorded and transmitted in real time to General Hayes and a review board that includes representatives from the highest levels of government. Holloway's confidence faltered for the first time during their conversation. Lieutenant Colonel, that's not possible. Electronic surveillance in this section of the parking garage has been disabled, and communication signals are being jammed by equipment that my team activated before this conversation began. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she felt the tactical advantage shift in her direction. Director, that equipment is designed to block traditional communication systems. But Shadow threat operatives were equipped with communication technology that operates on frequencies and protocols that aren't included in standard jamming arrays. She withdrew her hand from the jacket pocket, revealing a device that looked like an ordinary button but was actually a sophisticated transmission system developed specifically for shadow threat operations. This conversation, including your admission that you've been eliminating American intelligence operatives under official protocols, has been recorded and transmitted to multiple secure locations. Even if something happens to me, that information will reach people who have the authority to investigate and prosecute these activities. Holloway's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching desperation. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, you don't understand the larger picture. The investigation into Shadow Thread revealed connections to activities that could compromise national security at the highest levels. The operatives who were eliminated weren't just security risks. They were potential assets for foreign intelligence services who had learned to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities created by deep cover work. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Director, are you telling me that some Shadow Thread operatives were actually compromised? That they had been turned by foreign intelligence services? I'm telling you that the psychological profiles developed during the program's final years showed that several operatives had developed emotional attachments and loyalty conflicts that made them susceptible to recruitment by the very people they were supposed to be monitoring. The line between deep cover and actual defection had become dangerously blurred. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Holloway was telling the truth, the elimination of Shadow Thread operatives wasn't just institutional paranoia. It was damage control for a program that had produced double agents without realizing it. Director, if operatives had been compromised, why wasn't that information shared with oversight committees? Why was the solution elimination rather than extraction and debriefing? Holloway's laugh was hollow. Lieutenant Colonel, because extraction and debriefing would have revealed the extent to which Shadow Thread had lost control of its own personnel. The political implications of admitting that we had created American intelligence operatives who were working for foreign governments would have destroyed congressional support for intelligence operations for decades. Sarah realized that she was facing a situation far more complex than she had imagined. Holloway wasn't just a rogue administrator eliminating inconvenient personnel. He was someone tasked with cleaning up intelligence disaster that could have compromised American national security for generations. Director, what about the 3 operatives who are still active? If you're concerned about compromised loyalties, why haven't they been eliminated? Holloway's expression became grim. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, those 3 operatives represent the most successful Shadow Thread assets ever developed. Their intelligence gathering has prevented multiple terrorist attacks and provided advance warning of several foreign intelligence operations against American interests. But their psychological profiles also suggest they've been so thoroughly integrated into their cover identities that extraction might be impossible without compromising operations that could save thousands of lives. Sarah felt the weight of impossible decisions settling on her shoulders. The 3 active Shadow Thread operatives weren't just intelligence assets. They were human beings whose psychological health had been sacrificed for national security objectives. But they were also potentially the only early warning system America possessed against certain types of asymmetric threats. Director Holloway, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 15 years making life and death decisions, I propose a different solution. Instead of eliminating the remaining Shadow Thread operatives, we establish a new oversight protocol that acknowledges the psychological realities of deep cover work while maintaining operational security. She paused, studying Holloway's expression for signs that he was open to alternatives to elimination. The jacket I'm wearing isn't just a piece of equipment. It's a symbol of adaptability. Shadow Thread taught us that the most effective intelligence operations require the ability to change and adapt rather than simply following predetermined protocols. Holloway considered her words for a long moment before responding. Lieutenant Colonel, what you're proposing would require congressional approval and oversight committee review that could expose classified operations to political interference. Director, what you're currently doing involves murdering American intelligence operatives based on psychological assessments that may not accurately reflect their actual loyalties. I think congressional oversight represents an acceptable risk compared to the alternative. The sound of approaching vehicles indicated that General Hayes had decided to intervene in the confrontation despite the potential security implications. Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the Shadow Thread program, but the future of American intelligence operations in an era where the line between national security and institutional paranoia had become increasingly difficult to define. As military police vehicles surrounded the parking garage, Sarah Chun touched the worn fabric of her jacket one final time, knowing that whatever happened next, the program that had defined her adult life was about to undergo changes that would either save it or destroy it completely. The jacket had seen centuries of service in one form or another. Now it would witness the transformation of the intelligence community it had served so faithfully.